The Where Our Minds Wander podcast may contain sensitive content and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Greetings, fellow wanderers, to the places our minds wander.
The house at the end of the dirt road, where disembodied voices whisper and strange sounds make the living shiver.
Where shadows lurk at the edge of the woods, just outside your back door. And mysterious lights speed beyond reason across the clear night sky.
Odd events throughout time that lead you down the rabbit hole.
I'm Wes.
And I'm Beth.
And this is Where Our Minds Wander. Hello and welcome to Where Our Minds Wander, all you fellow wanderers. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone.
Well, October is finally here, which is my favorite month of the whole year because, it's that time, spooky time. And we've been breaking out our Halloween decorations.
Well, you broke them out in August. It's not like...
Well, yeah, to be fair, I do have a lot of decorations up all year round.
Yes, we're not leaving Count Batty up all year, are we?
Of course we are.
Count Batty is our newest addition to our skeleton family, and he is a 5-foot-tall bat skeleton, which is currently sitting in a chair in our living room. So,
right. Well, for those of you that are out there that don't know, Home Depot every year has these black bat skeletons. They're like 6 feet tall and have like a 6-foot wingspan, glowing red eyes. But the problem is, I've been wanting one for years, and they're always sold out. As soon as they come in, they're sold out, and you can't get any.
You got one this year?
Yeah, I scored. I started early.
In August.
Yeah, in August. And, we do have some of the other skeletons that are up all year, but they're doing various things. Like we have a couple at a tarot table doing the reading.
Right. And we have a pirate one next to all of our pirate stuff that we have.
Yeah.
Anyway, why don't you tell everybody about what's coming up for Halloween?
October. That means we're going to start all our spooky stories. I can't wait.
Yeah, I think next week we'll do a normal episode, but then the 2 after that will be all spooky stories. So that's pretty exciting for us anyway, because that's what we like. And speaking of spooky, if you, our listeners, are in need of a cool Halloween t-shirt.
Nice. T-shirt.
A t-shirt.
Well, I guess if you had a long enough shirt,
It would become shorts. It could be.
Maybe you could sew them up.
If you would like a normal t-shirt with some cool Halloween designs on it or a hoodie, you can always check out what we have to offer in our TeePublic store. And you can get there just by going to our website, whereourmindswander.com, and you can click on the link.
And while we're talking about spooky merch, you can also purchase our 13 Creepy Urban Legends book on our website as well.
We have a book tab. You just click right on it.
That's right, we do. And Christmas is coming up. It's always a good idea to start early.
Yeah.
Start your shopping early.
Might as well.
And I might be adding some new merch to the store.
That's always exciting.
I know.
You come up with cool stuff.
So what are you talking about tonight?
Well, a while ago, we did an episode on the Connecticut witch trials. And at the time, we were both researching it because it was one of those episodes where the topic was really huge. And so we split it where we were both doing the same topic. And while we were researching, I kept wondering why I had never heard about them before. And then I came across the disturbing fact that even our home state of New York had witch trials as well, with the last one being as recent as 1816.
No way, really?
Yeah. So for tonight's episode, I want to take a look at the New York witch trials. Throughout the 17th to 19th century, New York had at least 30 documented witch trials, some of which happened before the infamous witch trials of Salem, Massachusetts. According to some historians, the cases of people accused of witchcraft in New York would most likely have been much, much higher if it weren't for one simple fact. New York was primarily settled by the Dutch, who strongly opposed the idea of witchcraft trials and were generally tolerant and open to accepting people who were persecuted in other New England colonies. Unfortunately, due to the fire of 1911 in Albany, all of the original documents and records housed in the state capitol building pertaining to the state's trials were destroyed. So, the accounts we have to go on have been passed down through storytellers and amateur historians, which makes the work of verifying the accounts nearly impossible. But a few have stood the test of time, being passed down and retold enough that we still have partial stories to explore. And so I thought I would start with a few that actually have direct ties to the Connecticut witch trials that we covered in episode 58. All three of these accused witches fled to New York in hopes of starting over and putting the false accusations behind them. And although they weren't put on trial again, they didn't exactly receive the refuge and sanctuary they'd hoped for. So I'll begin with Catherine Harrison. Catherine Harrison was convicted of witchcraft in Wethersfield, Connecticut, in June of the year 1670. In order to escape her neighbors vandalizing her home and stealing her possessions, and to follow through with the court order of banishment, she made her way to Westchester County, New York. Westchester wasn't the haven she had hoped for. By 1672, she had sued 11 of her neighbors for defamation of property. 20 years later, Winifred Benham found herself the victim of community scorn and malice not once, but 3 times in Wallingford, Connecticut. According to the Chode News, the Benham family were one of the original founding families of Wallingford. But after a decade of living peacefully, Mr. Benham allegedly criticized the local magistrate and then threatened a neighbor, Mrs. Parker. Whether this is true or not, Benham's wife, Winifred, and their 13-year-old daughter, who was also named Winifred, suddenly came under suspicion of witchcraft. 4 local teenagers, 2 males and 2 females, claimed the 2 Benham women had inflicted bodily harm on them, causing dark spots to appear on their skin. When an infant passed away in town, the teens claimed the baby also had dark spots, and so did Mrs. Benham and her daughter. Mother and daughter were put on trial 3 separate times. At one of these trials, the townsfolk tied rocks to their feet and threw them into the river. Since both women were able to stay afloat, the town believed that they were witches. But recent laws in Connecticut meant that they couldn't be put to death. Although they were not convicted, the local attitude towards them was still pretty aggressive, and the 2 women decided to leave Connecticut and move to Staten Island, New York. There really isn't any further information on how Mrs. Benham or her daughter fared in New York, but it seems to be the general belief that they were treated pretty fairly. That wasn't the case for Elizabeth Garlick. Between 1657 and 1658, Elizabeth Garlick was accused of witchcraft while she was living in East Hampton, New York. A local 16-year-old girl, also named Elizabeth, had died 2 years earlier, and she just happened to be the daughter of Lyon Gardner, the founder of the first English settlement in the colony of New York. Elizabeth's death had been horrific. She had just given birth to her first child, and she fell terribly ill. During her illness, she had horrifying nightmares in which a black thing stood at the foot of her bed, which she later claimed was Elizabeth Garlick, quote, ready to pull her to pieces. At the end of her severe illness, the young girl allegedly shrieked, quote, a witch, now you are come to torture me because I spoke 2 or 3 words against you. Believing that Elizabeth Garlick was to blame, the local magistrate began an investigation. Several of her friends and neighbors came forward, claiming she had used black magic to harm not just their livestock, but themselves as well. This included the deaths of 4 local children. In 1658, Garlick was called to court in Hartford, Connecticut, since at that time New York was under Connecticut's jurisdiction. The charge against her was, quote, some detestable and wicked arts, commonly called witchcraft and sorcery, you did, as is suspected, maliciously and feloniously practice at the said town of Seattlecott in the East Riding of Yorkshire on Long Island. Hartford, by the way, was not the place you wanted to go for a witch trial. The trial took place on May 5, 1658. Several of her neighbors made the journey as well to testify against her, blaming her for the deaths of her children. An additional couple, Jeremiah and Catherine Vale, testified that Garlick had taken on an indigenous child to nurse in order to earn a little money, and she had favored this child because of the money and let her own child starve. That was more than enough for Connecticut Governor John Winthrop the Younger to suspect her, and he announced at her trial, quote, Elizabeth Garlick, that not having the fear of God before thine eyes, thou hast entertained familiarity with Satan, the great enemy of God and mankind, and by his help since the year 1650 have done works above the course of nature to the loss of several persons, with several other sorceries, and in particular the wife of Arthur Howell of East Hampton, for which both according to the laws of God and the established law of this commonwealth, thou deserveth to die. End quote. Although he believed that her behavior was highly suspicious, the jury was not swayed by the circumstantial and downright ludicrous testimony. However, they didn't just let her go. They charged her husband £30 and commanded him to make sure that she followed the rules of society for the rest of her life. Just to make sure that he was doing his job, they were ordered to return to court the following month in East Hampton as a cautionary measure. Elizabeth Garlick continued to live in East Hampton until her death. 7 years later, in 1665, Ralph and Mary Hall of Setauket were accused of witchcraft as well, after the deaths of their neighbor, George Wood, and his child a year earlier. The Halls' 3-year-long ordeal began on October 2, 1665, in the Court of Assizes, or the colony's High Court. After hearing various testimony, the court decided that Ralph Hall was innocent, but again, his wife wasn't let off the hook. Mary was considered under suspicion, even though they didn't have any real evidence that she had done anything wrong. For 3 years, she was required to attend every single court session, no matter what it was for, so that the court officials could ensure that she wasn't doing anything wrong. Ralph had to accompany her there every single time. Eventually, in 1668, Governor Nichols put an end to the ridiculous order and released Mary from her sentence. A newspaper article titled "She Died for Witchcraft, Story of Early Days in a New York State Village, Woman Slain with Silver Bullets," was published in the Cambridge Sentinel in 1912, describing the plight of an unnamed woman simply known as the Witch of Esperance. The article told the tale, or legend as they referred to it, of a French woman who lived with her husband on the Schoharie River in the late 1700s, near present-day Duanesburg in Schenectady County, New York. The husband passed away, and the widowed woman remained in their little house on the outskirts of the village. She spent her days, quote, planting her garden, raising chickens, and managing in her frugal French way to live. Perhaps she went to the town, gaunt and hungry, to pick up some odd work or to ask for some relief. At any rate, she could not talk English and was mysterious, end quote. Because she didn't speak English, the townsfolk referred to her as the Grenadier Woman, and they began spreading rumors about her. She was the reason her husband had died, and she was the reason the crops were failing and their livestock was wasting away. At some point, several townsfolk met in the local church and decided something had to be done. They wouldn't bother with a trial. They would simply take matters into their own hands. The article continues that the men fashioned bullets out of melted silver and went off to the woman's cabin. They peered through her windows at her, and their suspicions were confirmed when they noticed two things. There were two small children playing at her feet, and she was cooking something over a fire. Without a word, one of the men aimed his gun and shot her right through her own cabin window with his silver bullets. To ensure that she wouldn't rise from the dead to exact her revenge, she was buried upside down in an unmarked grave under a pine tree on the north side of the village. Other versions of her story say that they buried her with a stake through her head and planted an evergreen tree in the soil over her grave to mark the spot. Now, the story of the Witch of Esperance can't be confirmed. There are no records indicating that it ever happened. But her story has all the hallmarks of a classic witch's tale. She was an outsider, she was unable to defend herself, she was cooking, and her grave was marked by a witch's tree. But is there a kernel of truth to her story? There certainly could be, since all of the records were lost. Today, an historical marker stands in Duanesburg, which reads, "Lived near here in 1800s, French settler accused of witchcraft by New England settlers, killed by silver bullet shot through her window." The marker does indicate that it is part of the Legends and Folklore series granted by the William G. Pomeroy Foundation. But then there was Jane Caniff. Again, very little of Jane's story can be verified due to the loss of the records from the 1911 fire. And all we know about her comes from one source, Dr. Frank Bertang Green's book, The History of Rockland County, which was published in 1886. But again, there most certainly could be some grain of truth to all of it. According to Dr. Green's book, Jane Caniff lived in Clarkstown, New York in the 1800s. This would be the town of West Nyack today. According to SleepyHollowHistory.com, Jane was an older woman who had been married twice and widowed twice. Her second husband had been a Scotsman and a doctor, and Jane had learned from him how to make herbal remedies to help her ailing neighbors. Dr. Green wrote that, quote, "From her deceased husband she gathered a smattering of medicine. She made wondrous concoctions with which she treated such as came to her for ails, and I have been informed by those who knew her with most excellent results." End quote. Now, you would think that this would keep her in her neighbor's favor, but it did not. Mostly because Jane liked to wear bold colors. She didn't style her hair like everyone else, and she had 2 pets, a talking parrot and a black cat. The couple's only son, Tobias, was also considered eccentric and antisocial by their neighbors. Then, little things began happening around town. A few women complained that their butter churned badly. Another complained that their cow, which had gone missing and then was mysteriously found standing inside an abandoned wagon, no longer gave milk. The cow belonged to a prominent member of the church. There was witchcraft about, and who else in their little town could be practicing dark magic except Jane Caniff, the herbalist with a talking parrot and a black cat. The local doctor, who should know, quote, real medicine from dark potions, was appointed town judge for a secret meeting where farmers gathered inside Pye's wool mill to discuss Jane Caniff's fate. They decided that a dunking was in order. They would bound her hands and feet and cast her into the nearest body of water. If she sank, she was innocent. If she remained afloat, she was a witch. The locals apprehended Jane and were on their way to carry out her dunking. They had succeeded in binding her hands and feet. But right before they could cast her into the water, a second group of neighbors arrived. This new group of neighbors insisted that rather than dunking her, she should be weighed against a Bible instead. And so Jane was brought to Owert Polhemus's grist mill, where there was a grain scale large enough to hold her. The Bible they chose to weigh her against had a cover made out of wooden boards and was attached to an iron chain. Often referred to as a brass Bible, it was quite heavy. Obviously, they chose this massive Bible on purpose, because the belief was if the Bible weighed more than she did, she had to be a witch. Jane stepped on the scale and, of course, weighed more than the Bible. She was free to go. But the year, by the way, was 1816. Local historians have been able to locate where they think Jane Caniff lived. It was a small, unpainted wood house just above the burial ground at the Old Dutch Meeting House on Germans Road. Her grave, however, has been harder to locate. Some believe she was laid to rest in an unmarked plot in that burial ground, which is now the Clarkstown Reformed Church Cemetery. Others believe she was laid to rest in the Germans Presbyterian Cemetery. However, that church was founded 44 years after her death in 1860, so that might not be right either. To date, no stones have been located with her name. That may be due to the rest of Jane Caniff's story, which in some ways may have taken on legend status rather than truth. The continuation of her story is that a few years after her trial by weighing, a terrible accident occurred at Pye's wool mill. One of Pye's children was crushed when a large wooden hammer weighing hundreds of pounds fell on top of him. For years, and still to this day, really, people claim that Jane Caniff somehow got revenge for being called a witch. But what does that say, really? That she was a witch and somehow caused a horrific accident? Unfortunately, that's the problem with the stories of these men and women accused of witchcraft in the state of New York. Without the original records, there's very little we can do to give these people their true, honest stories back. We can't verify the facts, and so their stories are forever tied to the folklore that people have passed down about them. But I guess, in some ways, it means they won't be forgotten. However, I really, really do wish that there was a way to tell their actual stories.
God, what a brutal time to live.
I know.
If you sunk, you're innocent. If you float, you're a witch.
And you'd be hung anyway.
I mean, where's the common sense
I know.
in all that?
I know. And you could be accused, we've talked about this before, you could be accused for absolutely anything.
Right.
It didn't rain for a week. Oh, there's a witch in town. It must be the woman we don't like who keeps to herself.
Or any outsider that came in.
Yeah.
And the local groups of women started gossiping about because they didn't know them or they just found them peculiar.
Yeah.
That could be it for them.
I know. The part that got me was their butter didn't churn correctly. So it must be...
Or
Must
the
be a
cow
witch.
was standing in the back of the wagon.
Yeah. I know.
Just unbelievable. It wasn't that long ago.
1816 was not that long ago. That blew my mind.
I know.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe.
I know.
It makes you wonder we're going to be in another 100, 200 years.
Oh, they'll probably look back on us and be saying the same thing.
I know.
You know?
I know.
What do you mean they didn't understand multi-dimensions or string theory or, what do you mean they couldn't figure out how to colonize Mars?
I know. I'd love to be around then.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh, well.
Oh, well.
And we'll be right back after this quick break.
Hey, did you know? Scarecrows have been around for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians used them to scare away quail. The ancient Greeks created theirs out of wood to represent their gods. But it was the ancient Romans who put the scare into scarecrows, carrying theirs into battle to frighten their enemies across Europe. European farmers quickly copied the idea, topping theirs with gourds to frighten off both birds and meddling children, creating a boogeyman legend to go with the figures. When Europeans arrived in North America, they brought their scarecrows with them, dotting their fields with straw-stuffed figures with gourds and later pumpkins for heads. Post-World War II, pesticides were used in place of scarecrows, making them purely decorative. An enduring symbol of harvest time, scarecrows soon became synonymous with Halloween, as well they should have, because who hasn't heard a creepy tale of a scarecrow coming to life on October 31st? Who'da thunk it?
All right, we're back.
Yes, and I'm anxious to just let you get started.
For my story tonight, we're headed to Tombstone, Arizona. For most Americans, just saying the name of this Wild West town instantly brings to mind images of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and the shootout at the OK Corral. But did you know that peering out the window of a nearby boarding house was an important woman that you may not know about? A woman known as Big Nose Kate. Eventually, Big Nose Kate would be tied to a grand hotel and a haunted saloon, but I'll get to that a little bit later. Mary Catherine Herney was born in Hungary on November 7th, 1849 or 1850, depending on the source. Throughout her life, she went by various names, like Kate Elder, Kate Fisher, and Mary Cummings. But during Tombstone's heyday, she was known as Big Nose Kate and as Doc Holliday's common-law wife. Who was she exactly? Well, she was no shrinking violet, that's for sure. Frequently referred to as, quote, tough, stubborn, and fearless, she was a notorious outlaw, gambler, and prostitute. Her father was a physician and a teacher, and in 1860, he and his second wife, Katharina, decided to immigrate to the United States with their children. They arrived in New York City, but then moved on to a predominantly German area near Davenport, Iowa, in 1862. Just 3 years later, both the doctor and his wife died within a month of each other, and the Herney children were taken in by their oldest sister, who was married. Over the next few years, Mary Catherine, or Kate as she was called, lived in several foster homes, including attorney Otto Smith. But by 1866, when she was 16 years old, she ran away, boarded a riverboat, and made her way to St. Louis, Missouri. Later in life, Kate claimed that she'd met a man named Silas Melvin in St. Louis, and they had a son together. But both he and their child died of yellow fever. This fact has not been verified by census records. Next, Kate claimed that she lived in the Ursuline Convent in New Orleans for a while. However, there are records that she was working as a prostitute for Madame Blanche Tribole in St. Louis in 1869. 5 years later, she had made her way to Dodge City, Kansas, where she was registered as a working girl in a brothel run by Bessie Earp, James Earp's wife. James just happened to be Wyatt Earp's older brother. Kate stayed there for about 7 years before picking up again and moving on to Fort Griffin, Texas in 1877. It was while she was there that she met Doc Holliday. One of the best descriptions I've ever come across of Doc Holliday came directly from Wyatt Earp himself. According to BigNoseKateTombstone.com, Earp said, quote, I found him a loyal friend and good company. He was a dentist whose necessity made him a gambler, a gentleman whose disease had made him a vagabond, a philosopher whom life had made a caustic wit, a long, lean, blond fellow, nearly dead with consumption, at the same time the most skillful gambler and the nerviest, speediest, deadliest man with a six-gun I ever knew. Doc Holliday's early years were as chaotic as Kate's. His mother died of tuberculosis when he was a teenager, and his father remarried just 3 months after her death. Doc enrolled in dentistry school in Philadelphia and earned his degree in dentistry in 1872. Before long, he was working as a dentist in Atlanta, Georgia. But that didn't last too long, as Doc had already contracted tuberculosis himself, most likely from his mother. And he was also known as a hothead, quick to pull his gun when people annoyed him. But hoping a drier climate would clear his lungs and extend his life, he hopped on a train and took it all the way to the end of the tracks and found himself in Texas. In later years, friend Bat Masterson claimed that the drier climate story was all hooey and that Doc had left Atlanta because he had gotten in trouble for waving his gun at the wrong person. Once he was in Texas, Doc opened up his own practice, but his constant coughing scared patients away. He needed to make money, though, and he discovered that he was quite good at gambling. His quick temper led to several shootouts, and Doc was forced to travel the country, from Texas to Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and back to Texas, running from the U.S. Marshals and Texas Rangers all the while. While Doc was dealing cards at John Shancy's Saloon, he met an attractive, well-educated woman named Kate, and by all accounts, she did have a rather large nose. She was the one who introduced him to Wyatt Earp, a decision that she later regretted. According to allthat'sinteresting.com, she once said, quote, "The Earps had such a power, I could not get Doc away from them," end quote. But nevertheless, Kate did like Doc a lot, especially his wit and recklessness, and Doc liked Kate for her intellect as well. At one point, Doc said that Big-Nosed Kate was his intellectual equal, and the two were pretty much inseparable. But Big-Nosed Kate had a temper as fiery as Doc's, and she was quick-witted too. When Doc found himself in huge trouble for shooting a man, even though it was in self-defense, Big Kate knew that a local posse intended to drag Doc from his hotel room, where he was confined since there was no jail. She set fire to his shed as a distraction, and as the townsfolk rushed to combat the blaze, she confronted the single guard that was posted in front of Doc's room and threatened him with 2 pistols until she and Doc could escape. They followed Wyatt Earp to Dodge City, where they registered at the local hotel as Mr. and Mrs. J.H. Holiday. Then the couple traveled together across the country, as Doc had done before, settling for a little while in various towns. Doc would open up a dentist shop, and Kate would sign on at a local brothel or dance hall. By 1880, the couple was in Tombstone, having followed the Earps there, after Wyatt promised them that they could make good money. And they did, when they weren't arguing. Kate and Doc argued a lot, and were often violent towards each other. At one point, after a particularly bad fight, Kate found herself in a saloon with the sheriff, who plied her with alcohol until she signed an affidavit that named Doc as a murderer and a thief. The Earps intervened, providing Doc with an alibi, and Doc, who was understandably angered by her betrayal, put Kate on a stagecoach bound for Globe, Arizona. Doc allegedly told Wyatt, after he had fought with Kate, quote, "You know, I had to quiet her, Wyatt. I just hit her gently over the head with the butt end of my gun." Just a few months later, she was back in Tombstone, and she and Doc picked up right where they left off. Tombstone just happened to have one of the finest hotels in the state, the Grand Hotel, which opened in 1880. Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and the Clanton gang all stayed there from time to time. According to BigNoseKateSaloon.com, the hotel had thick carpeting, luxurious wallpaper, walnut furniture, chandeliers in the lobby, expensive oil paintings, and 16 bedrooms. And each bedroom had its own window. Downstairs, there was a reading room, a bar, and a kitchen with a 12-foot-long cooking stove. In the basement was a massive bar. It was the place to stay if you were somebody. The Grand Hotel burned down in 1882, but it comes into play later. Kate later claimed that she had witnessed the infamous shootout at the OK Corral from the bedroom window of C.S. Fly's boarding house. Kate claimed that earlier in the day, a man with a bandaged head came looking for Doc, but Miss Fly had turned him away. The man had been carrying a rifle, which Wyatt Earp, who was the town sheriff at the time, had outlawed inside the city limits. The man just happened to be Ike Clanton. The shootout at the OK Corral between the Earps and the Clantons lasted under a minute, but it has become the ultimate example of Wild West outlaws versus Wild West lawmen. Kate and Doc continued to see each other off and on until 1882, when Doc left for Colorado without her. In 1887, she traveled to Colorado as well to visit her brother, but there's no record of her ever seeing Doc Holliday again. Doc passed away that same year. Kate stayed in Colorado and eventually married a blacksmith named George Cummings on March 2, 1890. Kate and George traveled from one Colorado mining camp to the next until the couple moved to Bisbee, Arizona. Kate opened up a bakery there. Kate and George didn't have the best relationship, And when George turned to drinking heavily and began physically abusing Kate, she ended their marriage in 1900. Never down for long, Kate moved to Cochise, where she landed a job at the Cochise Hotel. According to allthat'sinteresting.com, she then moved in with a man named John J. Howard, a miner who passed away in 1930. She had worked for him for 30 years when he had passed, and he left her everything he owned. However, that didn't sit well with Kate, so she settled his inheritance with his children. A year later, she petitioned the Arizona state governor to allow her to take up residence in the Arizona Pioneers Home, a home for destitute and ailing miners and male pioneers of the Arizona Territory. It took 6 months before the state would admit her, not because she was a woman, but because she wasn't a U.S. citizen. By this time, Kate was 80 years old, and she just happened to be the first female resident there. For the next decade, she worked tirelessly to improve the living conditions at the home, contacting the governor directly whenever her efforts weren't resolved to her satisfaction. She rarely talked about her time with Doc Holliday, only agreeing to be the subject of one biography during her life. When she was asked about her life, she said, quote, "Part is funny and part is sad, but such is life, any way you take it." Kate passed away on November 2nd, 1940, at the ripe old age of 91. She was buried in the Arizona Pioneers Home Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona, under the name Mary Kay Cummings. So, Big Nose Kate was definitely an interesting woman. But you might be wondering how the Grand Hotel, Kate, and a haunted saloon all connect together. Well, I'm going to tell you how. In 1985, a saloon was built right on the spot where the Grand Hotel once stood. The owners named it Big Nose Kate Saloon. Considered the perfect cowboy bar, HauntedHouses.com describes it as having a long bar on the first floor, as well as an area for musicians to play. But down in the basement, there's all kinds of cool things to see. First, there's another bar that allegedly came directly from the Grand Hotel. There's also a Southwestern-themed store called The Shaft that sells clothing. But there's also a creepy tunnel dug into the floor. The tunnel is tied to a local legend known as the Swamper. Back in the days when the Grand Hotel was still around and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were staying there, a wanderer came into town looking for a job. The Grand Hotel was willing to hire him on as a sort of handyman and janitor, and the man, who never gave his name, was allowed to live in the basement as part of his pay. Now, by all accounts, he was a hard worker, and despite being given the unflattering nickname, the Swamper, the man was both reliable and trustworthy. Or so they thought. You see, during his off hours, the Swamper was pretty busy. Using his pick and shovel, he was meticulously digging a tunnel into the basement floor, hoping to connect with one of the silver mines that ran underneath Tombstone. He managed to pull quite a bit of silver from the mine, illegally of course, and yet that's where the legend basically ends. No one knows how it all panned out, no pun intended, or how or when the Swamper passed away. But plenty of people say that his spirit still haunts the basement of Big Nose Kate Saloon. According to the article, The Legend of the Swamper Lives On in Tombstone, by Luz Delia Caballero, the Swamper doesn't really appreciate it when visitors get too close to his tunnel. It's not unusual for people to feel pushed or shoved. Even the employees have reported strange things by the tunnel. For example, some of the merchandise that they store in the basement tends to move on its own. And in at least one instance, T-shirts came flying off the shelves. They have also reported hearing a man's disembodied voice saying both "get out" and "stay away from here." One story from the Big Nose Kate Saloon website is that one day, several employees and the owner decided to explore Swamper's Tunnel. They were surprised to find out that it still led fairly safely to some old tough-nut mine silver shafts. On their way back to the saloon basement, they all heard what sounded like heavy footsteps coming down the stairs into the basement and loud moaning. Convinced that someone had broken in, they immediately searched the premises, only to find all the doors still locked from the inside, and the building was completely empty. One female employee claims to have felt ice-cold hands around her throat while she was in the basement. The swamper has even showed up in photographs, taken in all different parts of the saloon, but most commonly in the basement. One of those photos was turned into a postcard that's sold in the saloon shop. But the swamper isn't the only ghost, of course. Many visitors and employees have reported encounters with who they thought were Doc Holliday, Morgan Earp, Virgil Earp, and Big Nose Kate herself. Others report more generic cowboy spirits that they don't have a name for. Whoever these cowboy spirits may be, they can get a bit rowdy. Frequently seen standing in the doorways or the bar itself as dark, shadowy figures, these spirits don't necessarily interact with the living directly. It has been alleged that one was responsible for knocking over cases of beer in the basement. In general, people report hearing the sounds of laughing and singing in empty rooms of the building. Or they hear the distinct sound of doors opening and shutting when no one else is around. Lights shut off for no reason, or blaze back on despite no one touching a light switch. Silverware has been seen flying off tables. And perhaps the most unnerving is the two mannequins that are posed at a table on the saloon's balcony. At times, the mannequins seem to move by themselves, or have even been found on the ground. So as you can imagine, Big Nose Kate Saloon is a popular spot for people to take all kinds of photographs. It's brightly decorated with all kinds of Wild West era stuff. But people have reported having weird problems with their cameras and discovering strange light anomalies in their photographs, almost as though a smudgy mist has formed while they took the photo. So, whether you visit the saloon because you're into Tombstone and you want to go to a great bar, or if you know Kate's history and want to visit a place that celebrates her legacy, the Big Nose Kate Saloon is a pretty cool place, especially since you might literally bump into some Wild West legends from the past while you're there.
That sounds like such a cool place.
It most definitely is. And I was checking out the pictures online. And yeah, it's definitely a place you'd want to go to with a family. They have a pretty good menu from what I saw.
Huh. I'm just glad that she has a saloon named after her so that people ask the question, who was Big Nose Kate?
I know. It really helps continue her story. Oh, and I got to mention, the drink menu looks really good.
No fire water?
No, but pretty close to it.
I was thinking while you were telling your story that I know that Tombstone, the movie, is one of your favorite Westerns.
That it is.
With Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer. Nobody can touch Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday.
No, he was Tombstone.
He was. He made that movie.
Right. Without Val Kilmer playing the role, Tombstone wouldn't be what it is today.
Yeah. But I was thinking that the character of Big Nose Kate is in the movie, but she's only in it for like 2 minutes.
Right.
And you have no idea what her name is or why she's there, other than she just seems like she's a random saloon girl that he hangs out with.
Well, they weren't focusing on the women in their lives.
Right.
They were focusing more on the main characters.
The conflict and what led up to the shootout. I know, but still, I don't know.
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too bad they wouldn't have done a movie about Big Nose Kate and Doc Holliday leading up to that part.
Mm-hmm. That could be a great movie.
Yeah.
As a completely different film.
Yes.
Yeah? Huh. Very nice, honey.
Well, if any of you are in the entertainment world, there's a pretty good idea.
Oh, we don't want, credit or anything.
I do. I want to see my name in the credits. It was my idea.
Maybe you should write it.
I don't have time. With all the research for each week's episode?
Yeah. Writing a screenplay isn't something that you could fit in.
You barely had time to write a novel.
Well, this is true. But, Well, anyway, everybody, if you would like to know more about the witch trials that took place in New York State, well, it was a colony, but you know what I mean, or more about Big Nose Kate, you can always check our sources in our show notes.
That you can. And with that said, join us again next week for an all-new episode of Where Our Minds Wander.
See you soon.